Hello, Simon. Thank you so much for being here with us today for Chung Institute podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You are an assistant professor at the department in the Department of Counseling.
I actually got tenure, so I'm an associate professor now, but that's I need to update some website somewhere.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you're also affiliate faculty at Center for Healthy Minds. Is that correct?
Yep.
Great. And tell me a little about the work you're doing. I saw you're doing a lot of work with the veterans and mindfulness meditation in the clinic. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So these days we're doing a lot of the work that I'm focused on is related to the Healthy Minds program mobile app. So broadly, I'm interested in sort of psychological interventions of various kinds. Had sort of started more in the psychotherapy realm. I'm trained as a psychologist and psychotherapist. Worked a lot clinically in the VA with veterans, and over time, I've come to be concerned, is maybe one way to put it, or really to see that there will always be a wide gap between the availability of providers and the mental health treatment needs. And for me, that gap's really been the motivation to study digital interventions. So a lot of the work the past few years that we've been doing has really been focused on a digital well-being meditation-based smartphone app.
Oh, wonderful. How did you get into this?
Part of it, how life goes, it's often what they call it planned happenstance, that it's all happenstance at the end of the day, but you try to put yourself in situations where things can happen. So for me, some of that was a postdoc that I did at the University of Washington with a group out there that was focused on technology. And then, our whole society is becoming more and more technological in many ways. So just have been inspired by the idea that we can sort of use technology as a force for good, and not just a force to torment our minds and each other. So that's been a lot of the inspiration. I happened to, when I came back to the University of Wisconsin, they developed this Healthy Minds program app, Cortland Dahl and others from a partner nonprofit called Healthy Minds Innovations. So this app existed and it was really kind of ripe to be tested. So that's really a lot of what we've been doing, the last 5 or 6 years now.
Amazing. We work with a lot of veterans and most of them prefer to stay online.
Yeah.
So it's really phenomenal. You create a program just for them also.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the meditation work I did in the VA was often group-based. This was pre-COVID when I was working in the VA system. So we'd have in-person groups, and I really am a strong believer in the power of relationships and human connection. I think that can certainly happen online, but also can happen really powerfully in in-person settings. So that was always inspiring to me, seeing veterans working with these practices that have been around for thousands of years and finding relevance for the particular challenges that people were bringing in.
Yeah. What is that like in modern society? I mean, bridging science, bridging Eurocentric psychology and counseling with ancient wisdom, with mindfulness, with these traditions that many people are trained to reject in the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we have really, I think, beautiful lineages in both the contemplative traditions and in the scientific or biomedical traditions. So really fortunate. I mean, for me, I was born in 1982, which was the year Jon Kabat-Zinn did the kind of earliest mindfulness-based stress reduction study. And they've, Jon Kabat-Zinn, Richie Davidson, many of these kind of their generation, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg on the contemplative practice side, there's been, I think, this really beautiful integration that's been happening. And we happen to be working in a time where that work's happened. And there's sort of a fertile ground, so to speak, that's been laid. From my understanding of the history of Buddhism, and I'm sure you know much more about this topic than I do, there is this sort of shape-shifting that Buddhism does as it moves across cultures. And in my mind, it's not surprising at all that some of the shape of the Dharma, so to speak, in the West has a scientific biomedical in some contexts, maybe even self-help orientation that looks different than it might have in traditional Buddhist countries, but still I think has some core elements, these kind of universal elements that help people work with their minds. And I think that's really the seed that's making this all possible, is that these strategies speak to core aspects of the human experience, no matter who you are.
Are there challenges that you're experiencing, kind of bridging these two fields together?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of, I mean, doing scientific research is hard. There's a lot of dukkha in the world of science. And certainly getting grants is really hard. Running studies is hard. Knowing what you can kind of conclude with confidence is hard. One of the challenges that we come across regularly in our meditation app work, and this is true across the spectrum of these sort of digital health interventions, is keeping people and getting people engaged and keeping them engaged. And I think in some ways, meditation, like physical exercise, is effortful. And although it can be pleasant, and certainly as one gets more experience, there might be more kind of reinforcing moments. But I think for many of us, especially those of us who come to it with mental health challenges, it can be really unpleasant and overwhelming and discouraging when we start working with our own minds. So I think that that's a challenge that doesn't seem to me so unique to the scientific integration. It's just sort of a challenge of having a human mind and trying to learn to work with it in a skillful way. But that's a major one.
Yeah, I took a course once where they show the neurons in the brain as we try to change a habit and how they resist. And
yeah, it feels that way, doesn't it?
yeah. So when it comes to doing these studies, to bring it to the university settings, to bring it to the general public, of course, funding is one thing, and convincing people that this is worth funding.
Yep.
How do you convince people that this is worth even listening to, or even 5 minutes of practice?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's become very popular, so people are being convinced. So I don't feel like, a lot of my practice background was in the Zen tradition. You know, the model is you have to sit outside the door for 3 days in the snow before the teacher will let you in. And so that, you know, I've come sort of very suspicious in a way of proselytizing. So a lot of, even when I was doing my own work as a therapist, it was rare for me to recommend meditation to someone. I really felt like people had to want it and ask for it. So I think we're at a historical moment where people are asking for these practices. It's out in the kind of cultural zeitgeist enough that people are aware of it. They're curious about it. And I think it's more of a question of having high quality instruction out there, or kind of versions of these practices that don't water it down too much, but also are accessible to people. But it's certainly, I mean, in the VA system, there are, you know, some of these mindfulness-based interventions, for example, that are out there that people can access. It's really quite amazing when you think about it. And not that that's the same as Buddhism. I mean, those are intentionally secularized, of course, but still have some of the core practices for training the mind.
Yeah. So how, Simon, do you do contemplative research without diluting the tradition with making it accessible?
Yeah. And this, I mean, to your question about challenges, I do think that this is a fundamental challenge that you sort of are going to be criticized on either side. And I do think there are versions of these practices that can be kind of honestly secularized. Like, I don't think MBSR is secret Buddhism, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Right.
But it does have elements of it that are clearly drawn from the Buddhist tradition. I don't lose a lot of sleep over. I have a lot of faith in the practices, and I don't lose a lot of sleep over worrying that people aren't going to I don't worry too much about watering down, quite frankly. I think that the practices themselves have so much power and this magnetism that people can kind of touch into a possibility that for some people, not for everybody, but for some people can be really inspiring and draw people in a way that as someone testing an intervention, I don't have to exactly have a plan for. There has to be enough there for them to kind of have footholds, but kind of letting the practices and the individual's motivation to in Buddhism, we might say wake up, but to relieve suffering, that has a lot of power, I think.
And how did you get started with Zen?
So that was planned happenstance. Also, I was living in Asheville, North Carolina. I'd gotten introduced to meditation in college, and then had moved there, mostly practicing in the Vipassana tradition. And there happened to be these amazing teachers who had a center outside of town. So I went, started practicing with them. Lived there for 2 years. Was a resident at the Windhorse Zen Center for a few years, and then decided I wanted to go back to grad school to study meditation scientifically. It was kind of my journey.
Amazing. And how does that work now with the Center for Healthy Minds is more Tibetan, Vajrayana, and you have the background in Zen. So how do you bridge these two? Or is there a need to even bridge them? Is there even a division in your eyes?
Yeah, there are people here who are devoted Tibetan practitioners, but there's plenty of folks who've, spent a lot of time doing Vipassana practice or doing Zen practice. I've been doing more Vipassana practice myself these past few years, but I don't feel a lot of tension around that. In the practices that we're studying, they're not, we're not in the Healthy Minds app. There are no prostrations or no visualizations in the sort of traditional. It doesn't have kind of like a Buddhist look to it in that way. And it's been fun. There's aspects of these other traditions, like the devotional element, for example, from Tibetan Buddhism, that kind of devotion to teacher feels different to me, at least from my limited sense of the Tibetan lineage. But that's been really fun to kind of hear stories and even get to interact with some teachers who come through town or might visit the center from different traditions. But it hasn't felt like there's no pressure, certainly, to kind of convert, so to speak, to a different practice style. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. One thing we're trying to do is bridge all the three major traditions. Because at the time of the Buddha, 25,000 plus years ago, right? There wasn't like, you have to be this, you have to be that. Yeah. So even I wear the Mahayana robe, and we learn all the aspects of traditions.
Yeah.
And so I love hearing your story with that. Thank you. Now tell me, Simon, when you work with veterans, and there are veterans who maybe want to learn Buddhism, and then there's the other side who are just like, don't want any of that, just want to heal the trauma. Yeah. And if you're doing a group, for example, and you have both in the same room.
Yeah.
Tell me, how does that work in clinical practice?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I haven't been practicing clinically since I moved back to Madison in 2018. I was working in the VA for my postdoc and for my internship and all through grad school. So my stories are a little dusty and my memories are a little dusty. But in the VA setting, at least, it never felt particularly appropriate to really do a deep dive into Buddhism. You might have a veteran who really is interested in that, and maybe you get into a conversation and discuss a book or something like that, or recommend a book or something like that. But I haven't, in those settings, it hasn't felt appropriate to kind of do a deep dive or sort of a nudge into Buddhism per se. So that particular issue hasn't come up. But I will say, and I think that Jon Kabat-Zinn's a beautiful example of this. He wrote, "Wherever you go, there you are." And I don't know, is that a Buddhist book? Is that a transcendentalist book? Is that a psychology book? Like, it's in the same with mindfulness-based stress reduction. There's elements from it, certainly Zen quotes, and yoga element. There's these kind of mashups that are hard to call any particular thread of Buddhism. And I think he did that intentionally. And I'm sure that there are people who, take a course in the VA system or are exposed through whatever means and then get very intrigued by where these practices come from and can kind of go down that rabbit hole, so to speak, as their interest draws them. But I haven't felt, and I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your answer to that question. I suppose you're wearing the robe, so it's unequivocal.
Well, it's your interview, but okay. Yeah. Lately we've been having, like I said, a lot of veterans come through, and we do have some who are interested in learning more about Buddhism, and some who are just like, give me the teachings, and I don't want to learn anything else.
Yep.
So we just try to meet them where they are in that way. We have a few veterans who actually want to take 5 precepts suddenly and with their families, and then we have some who again are just like, when you talk about that, I'm leaving the room.
Yep. Totally.
So we try to find a bridge to that.
I love that.
Yeah.
And there's precedent for that, isn't there? Like upaya or skillful means, that even in the Pali Canon, at least, that you'd give different teachings depending on who the audience was.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with these, it's not about somebody, like you said earlier, having to convert to anything.
Yeah.
It's like just freedom from suffering. All of us don't want to suffer. All of us want to be happy.
Yep.
So this actually brings me to the next question for you, Simon. For those who really don't want to suffer, but in academia, there's so much pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So many professors are under pressure where they're experiencing suffering, students, postdocs. Now, what does that look like in the context of this kind of research that you're doing at Center for Healthy Minds or University of Wisconsin?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a very timely question because there are some unique pressures, or it feels like particular stressors in this moment. At the center, we aspire to really embody the kind of culture of well-being that we hope to see in the world. And there's various ways that happens, and we try to implement that. At the end of the day, it's still kind of fundamentally, it's still doing, many of us are still doing scientific work at a Research One university with all of the same contextual factors that you'd find in another center. So we're all, you're still having to go through the peer review process, or you still have to go up for tenure, or you still have to submit grants, 90% of which won't get funded. Like, there's still kind of parts of that. So for me, I think it's important to be humble and recognize that we're doing our best, but it's not as though the center is some paradise that's, free from all of those challenges. I will say one of the things I try to stay connected with, and hope that my students and those that I work with are connected with, is that underlying motivation to relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind, and that this work is really a way of hopefully having benefit in the world. And I think that can be a very what's the opposite of unmooring? Mooring? Aspiration, that, we can do all this stuff. We can live in this context that, quite frankly, has some toxic elements to it. But if we're really connected with that aspiration, it can be really protective, I think. And then the other thing I'll say is that I think it's really important for the work to be fun.
Yeah.
And I think it has to have that sort of playful, joyful quality to it. And I think when that's there, there's a lot that's possible, and sort of a lot that one can put up with, and a lot that one can sort of avoid getting drawn into if there's that sort of joy element to it. And not that that's every moment, but that's certainly something I try to stay connected with, and hopefully can help students find and connect with too.
Yeah. So what happens when life is just like, no, Simon, no fun for you, and you have to motivate your mind?
Yeah.
What do you do?
I'm a Zen student, right? So and before that, I was a jazz trumpet player. So I spent many hours doing very boring things in practice rooms. So, you have to power through it. Some of my strategies, one, doing it with other people that you care about, and that could be very motivating. Like, I'm willing to do this for this colleague or this student or this friend. And then if there are ways to make it cozier, I live in Wisconsin. We have long winters. I have this giant thermos of tea. So I'll like set up my tea thermos, and I during COVID, I sort of went wild with loose leaf tea. So I make these weird tea combinations that no one else would want to drink, but that's sort of like my little coziness for powering through whatever the hard task is. A lot of it, I know a lot of us have our versions of this, but I think a lot of it is deciding how we want to spend our time and what are the things that we have to do to support others or to support our profession or to support our own kind of professional advancement, and what are things that we don't have to do, and that is simply being driven by greed or inability to set boundaries or say no. And that's very complicated. I would love to read someone else's book on that topic because I step in it all the time. But I think there are ways to kind of longer term make for a healthier life, even in academia.
I love that you mentioned the word greed. I feel like greed is something we see so frequently in academia and, quite frankly, in the entirety of the world, right?
Yep.
And it's funny because so many people, we like want to possess knowledge and we're like, no, I'm going to hold on to this.
Yeah.
But then it disappears anyway. But if we let it go, share with everyone, there's always more to come.
Yeah.
How do you work with greed?
So that, I don't know that there's been any research on this, and I don't know how widely held this view is in Buddhist circles, but at least in my Vipassana training, they'll talk about being a greed, hatred, or delusion type. And I am 100% a greed type. And my partner actually is a aversion type. So it's really funny. We'll be in these situations and we have kind of these opposite in a way reactions to different things. It's very funny to watch our minds do that. So greed is a very familiar hindrance to me. I think one of the ways that I try to work with it practically is by collaborating. I feel like that can be a way, that sort of team mentality. And I always appreciated those sorts of activities. Like when I was a kid, I didn't play a lot of video games, but when I did, I loved it when they were team video games, when you're kind of like playing together to try to accomplish something. And that's been helpful for me. And it can kind of soften that, like, I need this is for me versus other people. I guess kind of aggressive aspect of greed is maybe sublimated a little bit when it's cooperative. But it's a powerful force. And I have not vanquished it in my own mind or heart.
Thank you for your honesty. And I never heard of that, where it's like, what's your poison type, right?
Yeah, what's your
love type? Now it's what's your poison?
Yep. It's been helpful for me. I just see my mind do it. It's really easy. Like, that's just really magnetic for me. And I'll do it about silly like I was joking about it with the loose leaf tea, but I went nuts with it. Like, I have all these different varieties, and I got this book of recipes, and like, okay, I need my slippery elm bark, and it's just, my mind is sort of a collector mind that way. And that's fine. I just have to not let it be in charge. Yeah.
So you mentioned you don't know if there's any research done on this. And I'm curious then, what research is currently being done on your side? And what do you want to see manifest that you haven't seen yet?
Yeah. What research overall?
Yeah,
like, what are we working on?
That you're working on, that you're able to share.
Yeah.
What would you like to see happen?
Yeah, I love that. So like I said, a lot of our work the past few years has been studying the Healthy Minds program, which is this freely available meditation app. We're running a bunch of randomized trials where people are randomly assigned to get the app or get various control conditions. And the data's really quite promising, I think, that being randomized to receive the app is associated with benefits in various measures of mental health and well-being, things like depression, anxiety, stress. Have seen some effects on burnout. We've been testing it in various populations. Did a big study in the public school system. Have done some work with healthcare providers in Mexico. Work with different mental health populations with elevated depression or anxiety. And some of those studies, some of the more recent studies, have had some really kind of wild objective measures. A lot of that's done by self-report, but we're starting to try to get a sense of how these digitally delivered meditation practices might affect different aspects of biology and behavior. So that's kind of a new frontier. For me, my hope is that that people who could benefit would have access and would have, access through their healthcare providers, freely accessible versions, that this would be something that people would know is available that can be helpful to them. So that kind of implementation into the world, I think, is a really crucial next step. And related to that, really figuring out when are the cases where this is most likely to be helpful, when are cases where maybe this wouldn't be so helpful, or it might even be harmful for some people. How can we use these digital tools but not lose the human element or the connection with a teacher or guide? So those are all questions I don't think we've answered as a field, but I think are really exciting. And my hunch is that really moving this work forward, we won't want to have humans omitted from it. We can't, the kind of 50 minutes once a week psychotherapy is wonderful when people can access that. But I think we need to think outside that box to really move the needle on public health. But maybe there are still ways to involve humans. And then, of course, the innovations in AI open up all sorts of wild and potentially really helpful and potentially really harmful possibilities where people could interact in human-like ways with technology too.
Yeah. Wow, that's so big. What is the biology?
So we've been looking at, we've been looking at different markers of inflammation in particular, which of course is associated with lots of physical health and mental health problems to some degree. So seeing if digitally delivered training can impact different markers of inflammation.
And so outside of the Center for Healthy Minds app, what work do you want to see happen outside of AI, outside of maybe these non-human or post-human technologies?
I mean, I would love for us to, so that's, sometimes I've heard it described as sort of like the wide but shallow road of like these apps people practice. Maybe in our studies, they might practice literally 60 minutes over the course of 4 weeks, really small amounts of practice. And then there's the like narrow, deep style. And, you had mentioned coming off a long retreat. I'm super curious, and I really don't think we have good data on the kinds of things that can happen for people doing these practices super intensively. And we have that from monastics, and Richie Davidson and others have brought monastics into the lab and studied different elements of their brain and behavior. But I would love for us to be able to test that experimentally and really get a better sense of the potential of doing these practices intensively. And of course, that's, this is a monastic tradition in some ways in origin, not that lay people can't practice it, but really getting a sense of what is the kind of deep end of the pool, so to speak, do for people. And are there versions of that could be integrated into lay life even that would have public health benefit and benefit to society?
Yeah, in the future, I actually hope we can do that kind of study and really have compared the same practice for monastic and lay. Mm-hmm. What will happen? What will the effects be? The same practice for one who has been practicing a long time to this is their first time.
Yep. Yeah. And there have been some efforts. There even have been some efforts to get close to randomizing people to go on retreats, for example. I mean, retreats are a nice sized thing, like a week-long retreat. You might be able to convince people to be randomized to do it one week versus another week, and they have been able to do that successfully, even with longer 3-month retreats and things like that too. But there's so much potential, clearly, and in some ways it feels like we've only scratched the surface of what we might learn and what might be a benefit.
Yeah. How do you choose which practice to give?
Clinically
And
in our study,
and in that study, for example, if you were to do that study right now, if someone's like, "Here, Simon, I have a big grant for you. You got all the tools. What are you going to do?"
Yeah. That's a great question. My instinct would be, if it wasn't a group that was coming for Buddhism, my instinct would be to test one of the more secularized forms of retreat, say from the Vipassana tradition, where they have, there are Buddhist elements to it, but it's not just the week of prostrations. But I don't know that. I mean, we really, as far as I know, don't have good data on these kinds of questions. It's really an open question, and I think a really important open question. Anecdotally, it seems that some people respond more to some practices than others. And there might be, we're talking about hindrance types, but there might be, and I think in maybe in the Hindu tradition, maybe in the Buddhist tradition as well, there are kind of types that are drawn more towards devotional practice or more towards samadhi practice, or so there might very well be some of those pairings that we just haven't uncovered yet. I'm not really answering your question in part because I don't know that there is a clear answer to it yet, but it's a great question. I love it.
I appreciate your honesty, and I did throw you a bit of a surprise when we're live. So thank you for going through with it with me, Simon. Simon, research I have found to be so transformative, because the more I have found that I learn, the more everything changes. My whole life changes. And I have a feeling you have found something similar. So when one goes into research, how do they genuinely transform themselves and others, rather than, some scientists go in and they're like, I just got to do the work, got to finish it. So how do we keep the mind alive?
That's interesting. It's so funny. Because I think being involved in research has transformed me, not always in such helpful ways. And maybe like your sort of framing of it seems more hopeful is the word that's coming to mind, but I'm really grateful to have the job that I have and to get to do the work that I do. I think one way that it has transformed me maybe is maybe loosening some of my attachment to a particular view of the world. And I think that's true, and that's probably not true at the same time, because I think I also have maybe more firmly held views based on the work that I've been involved with. We have this kind of confirmation bias effect that we know is very strong, and I'm sure is strong in my own mind. And at the same time, I think there's a way that the aspirational orientation of science is to look for disconfirming evidence and to be open to disconfirming evidence and to make hypotheses and then test them. And then if they're found not to be true, to abandon them, which I think is a really beautiful way to orient. I mean, it's a little different than that maybe in practice, but I think that idea is really beautiful, and quite frankly is different than how a lot of the dialogue is happening in our culture these days. So I think it's kind of lovely antidote or counterpoint to having one's view and then kind of oppressing everybody else with our position. There can be more of a dialogue. And just to give a specific example, in science, the gold standard for sharing our findings is peer review. I didn't know this really before starting grad school. And you have to express your ideas, defend your ideas, share your data if it's an empirical study, and then your peers read it and they critique it. And then you have to respond to them. And that ability to respond to these critiques is a really core part of how the work gets out in the world. And that kind of vetting process and that dialogue, I think at its core is a really beautiful way to be sharing findings. So when you see them in a journal, you know that people have looked at them, that people can't just say whatever they want, that there's some sort of process that they have to go through that's mediated in a way through others that know things about the topic, hopefully.
Yeah. Being able to respond to critique. I connect that immediately to when you said greed.
Yeah.
Not being able to is like the greed of holding one's view.
Yeah.
So what's the right way, or maybe that's not the right word, but what's the way that you have found most beneficial to respond to critique?
I love to argue. Maybe if I'd ever been trained in like Tibetan debate, maybe I would have loved that. But there's a way, in my experience with peer review, it doesn't always go well. It's often very frustrating. But it does feel like one of those contexts where you can kind of, marshal your argument and gather data and respectfully disagree or change things based on the input that you're getting, that there's lots of different ways to kind of skillfully navigate that process that I find to be really fun. And, especially at journals they all have editorial boards, and where it's an editorial board that has a lot of expertise, I almost always am learning things and really often feel very grateful for the input that we get from reviewers in the process. It's harder when stuff gets rejected all the time, so that's always disappointing and can be frustrating, especially if you don't agree with them. But that's sort of softened for me over time. You just kind of move on and go somewhere else, and that just comes with the territory.
Wonderful. Simon, if people want to find you, people are interested in looking into the work you do or taking a class from you, how can they find you?
So they can find me on the Center for Healthy Minds website, or my Department of Counseling Psychology website. My email address is on there. It's always fun to connect.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon. I loved this conversation and really appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you for having me. I loved your questions.
Thank you.